Alright everybody, we get to now do the vanity tops. A lot of this video is a fast forward just because it is a pretty lengthy process. I didn't want to torture you through all of it. But similar process I do with all my sheet goods. I break them down into manageable sizes using my circular saw and my track saw. And once they're down to a rough size, I can glue them together and laminate them. This is 3/4 inch MDF board. So 2 layers be 1.5 inch thickness, which is standard cabinet thickness. I didn't get to cut them down to their final sizes again with the circular saw and door boards or straight edges, whatever happened to work at the time. I did make these roughly a hair larger than what they need to be, that way I can trim them to the wall whenever they're in place. Also, this is the reason I really didn't care how square the boards were when I was laminating them. A rough lamination is good. You're going to, again, trim it to final size and exact fit here. After they're cut to size, I place them on their vanities, and I'm going to outline the vanity cabinet on the bottom of the tops. That way I know exactly where my support pieces and stuff are going to be and where to avoid for my sink basin openings. Okay everybody, I kind of screwed up. I forgot to record cutting the vanity tops. I just, got away from me. I wanted to get productive, get some stuff done while I had an opportunity, and forgot to turn the camera on. So I just kind of explained what I did. The tops, it's laminated 3/4 inch, so it's 1.5 inch thickness. I wanted that because standard countertop thickness is actually pretty thick stuff. And I didn't want to do just a perimeter edge because I'd have to do one around the whole thing, and then I'd have to do one around the sink and the faucet opening. So, all I'm really saving is this little bit on each end. It's not worth it because then I gotta even shim it up to sit it on the vanity flat. So these I just did the whole thing and cut it as a solid piece. They're actually very, very heavy. This is the wide one, obviously. So it's 6 foot long, 2 foot deep. Well, it's 6 foot long, 4 foot wide is how much it weighs in MDF. So that's, 3/4 of a panel. I made a, where did I get it? I originally cut out the ovals for the sink instructions in sheets of MDF. Problem is jigsaw, I couldn't get it to cut vertical. It kept wanting to pitch and roll and all that stuff, so forget about it. Take 1/2 inch plywood, cut the oval I needed, clamped it down to my surface here, and then I used a router and slowly routed it out as I went, and that made its way through. So make sure if you do that, you have a big enough router. My big one's huge, and then doing several small passes. I think I did about 4 or 5 passes total to get it all hogged out so I could pop this core. And then I took a palm router with my 1/8 inch round over bit and rounded over all the edges. So these are undermount sinks, so it'll be finished on the inside, and then all the edges, and I even did the faucet opening just so I'm going to do these as epoxy countertops. The epoxies pull around that edge nice and smooth. They don't get that weak sharp corner because they don't like to pull around sharp corners. So, but big vanity top is done. Let's do the little vanity top is done. And now on to cleaning. I have to flip my camera here. Maybe. So I have to clean my shop, get it as dust-free as possible. There's mountains of tools and dust and all kinds of things. So the next step will be doing the primer sealer coat on these tops. And then my epoxy kit should be here today. So I'll hopefully get that done this weekend. Stay tuned for more. Alright, so after everything's cut open, it's time for 2 coats of bare paint and primer in one. These Vanity tops are going to be given a Stone Coat Countertop epoxy, exotic pour style, and they recommend either their epoxy undercoat or the bare paint and primer in one. The undercoat only comes in white and black. At the time of this video, we wanted a lighter color than black, but still relatively dark, so like a charcoal kind of color. Make sure I coat all my pieces. I do the edges with every coat of the surface. So each flat surface will get 2 coats, but the edges end up getting 4 total, just because MDF is pretty porous on the edges. So the more you add, the smoother it'll end up being when you're finished. This would be coat number 2, the bare paint and primer again. I'm still doing the edges every single time, so they get more than the surfaces, but that's just because they're going to absorb more as time goes on. Make sure your coat's good and even. It doesn't have to be perfectly flat. Actually, if it has a little bit of texture to it, it just adds depth to the epoxy pour, because it is pseudo-translucent. You can kind of see patterns through it if you really concentrate. Of course, the bosses have to come inspect. That's my manager and the assistant manager making their appearance. Now, once the paint primer is cured, I do a good scuff with 220 grit sandpaper, and then I'm going to tape the edges. And the idea here is to make a barrier, so when you pour the epoxy on it, it'll level throughout the surface and kind of tack up before it runs down the edges. If you just let it go, it's going to get so runny that the pattern will get pulled off. It'll look all stretched, and you're going to end up wasting quite a bit of material because it's just going to run off onto the floor. Now, I tried to cover every edge with this tape to make the wall. Those faucet holes are an absolute nightmare to get that tape to make a barrier wall. I didn't have any luck with it on the large Vanity. I got it to work on the small one, but just kind of gave up. Maybe next time I'll use something I can stick in that hole, like pool noodle or pipe insulation. Probably work to hold the epoxy in there long enough for it to set up. When you do the taping, I'm doing it twice. You want a pretty thick wall to hold the epoxy, because epoxy actually weighs quite a bit. One layer is just not going to hold. It'll just fold over itself. Again, the boss is coming out to tell me what to do. Make sure I'm not a total idiot screwing everything up. The little piece we were pointing at is actually a test panel we did. We wanted to make sure our color was right. So spend a little epoxy to do a small test panel. Make sure your colors are correct. Your patterns may not come out the same, but the color should be right. Also go through, level your pieces. Epoxy is very self-leveling. So if it's slightly higher or lower on one side, it's going to want to move towards the low end. Now, Stone Coat recommends 4 ounces per square foot on these exotic pours. I thought that was actually a little thin. I did 2 separate pours, one for the small top, one for the large top. And when I did the small top, I did the 4 ounces per, and then used the excess to make a smear coat. And I don't feel it was enough. 5 ounces per square foot, I think I would have done better. So the epoxy I'm using, I'm coloring with spray paint and using a vacuum there just to keep overspraying fumes down, and then a good thorough mixing once the spray paint's mixed into each can. And then I just take each one and mix it back into a big pot, spray paint every periodically, and it makes a nice random pattern when I pour it out. And so you see when I get empty with the cans, I'll actually turn them upside down. That way the epoxy can just run down onto the board, and I can use that to kind of smear it out a little bit. Epoxy has a lot of surface tension, and it only wants to go where other epoxy's at. So if you can get that surface wet, it'll run better, and you don't have to fight it so much because it'll try to avoid the dry spots. This is probably where I went wrong. I should have mixed up a small batch of epoxy just to make this smear coat. Clean gloves are a must. This stuff will stick to everything, and then just take it and start dumping. I'm using a tilt method, so I kind of pour it out and move the piece around and try to level it off as much as I can. And you can see I got kind of heavy there on the right hand side of that board, so I had to take it across the other side and kind of move some color that way just to give it a little bit of character. When it starts to smear, it starts to mix, and you don't get as much character into the pour. And you use a heat gun there to pop air bubbles or to move the product around. There we go. Now you can see the character flowing, and then it'll level itself back off over time again. So, initially I used a heat gun to pop air bubbles. The torch works far better. So after that sets up for a while, you pull your tape off the edges and just take a gloved hand and I smear those edges again just to wet them out. And the epoxy will start to flow and pull down those edges as long as you can get them wet. Boss is there actually kind of getting her hands dirty for a change, pulling the tape for me because my hands are covered in epoxy now. So yeah, just go through and just keep smearing. If I notice a dry spot, I'll break the surface tension and smear that up and just let it flow. One thing to keep in mind is lay sheets of plastic on the floor. Even though these things were on boards and the plastic pretty much covered an extension around the pour, this stuff still just found its way down to the floor, and I get chunks of epoxy to chip away. So I like this little piece. It had a lot of character in that. The dark black was kind of different to see.
Being exposed to the elements, mainly rain or water, so make sure you follow the directions and take your time to apply this properly.
And then same treatment on the little piece. Pull the tape, smear the edges, and let it flow.
For many, many months, and sometimes many years.
About every 30 to 45 minutes, I would come out with the mixing stick here, and what I'm doing is I'm scraping the drips off the bottom of the panel. If you don't do this, you'll get stalactites. So after that's cured I let it sit for a week or so, just because I didn't need the garage. Come back with 220 again, give it a good scuff, try to take the shine off. This will give a mechanical bond for the clear coat to adhere to when I pour it over the top. You get to see the epoxy goober stuck to the plastic there. Those will actually fall off because it doesn't want to stick to the plastic really. Now I am using that orange sanding block for the flat surfaces. I'm going to go back by hand and do the edges. If you use the block for the edges, there's a good chance you'll burn through and you'll expose the wood. So try not to do that. So after the sanding's done, you then clean. I just use dry shop towels, give it a good wipe. I regularly fold the cloth. I did this 3 or 4 times just trying to keep the dust off the surface. I don't want to seal dust in when I pour the clear epoxy from top of this. And then again, check for level. When you do the clear coat, it's going to flow just like the Exotic did. Your surface needs to be as level as possible. Now the clear epoxy again. And I mixed this a different way. I had a little trouble getting the small pour to solidify. It stayed tacky for a long time. So I'm going to use a different epoxy method that I saw. I'm going to sit here and mix it up in one bucket. And then take it and pour it all into another bucket, scraping everything out. And then I'm going to mix it again. And then I'll be ready to pour. So when you pour it out, this is the, I believe it's 1/8 inch square notch trowel. Stone Coat sells this. I was not able to find any stores. A couple bucks, well worth it. Gives you a nice even coat of the epoxy on there. And that way you're not putting on parts that are way too heavy, way too thin. It just spreads it out. And I try to coat the whole surface before I start dumping it over the edge. You want to make sure you have enough on there to cover it. Then you're going to take a brush and you start chopping. So dip your brush in your bucket of epoxy first. Get the brush wet. And then you just go through and just randomly start pecking at the surface. This will get rid of those troweling lines from the spreader. And then gives it a slight mix again. Just to make sure you won't have any tacky spots. And then I do the same treatment for all the other panels. Now I was concerned when I did this. This is supposed to be a clear epoxy, and after it was mixed up and poured, it turns that milk white. What that actually is those are air bubbles trapped in the epoxy from the mixing process. So you come back with a torch several times, and you actually pop those bubbles as they rise to the surface. And this actually did an excellent job of releasing air. Some epoxies don't. This stuff did an excellent job. So torch it coming from different directions. Make sure I'm not getting any patterns. Wipe my edges. I came back about every 15 to 30 minutes to check this and torch this just to get those air bubbles out. Be also super careful. The backsplash pieces are sitting real low on the surface and they end up melting the plastic in some spots. So be careful about the torch. So they're pretty well cured. Shooting this on my phone, so the video quality is going to be a little different than the Osmo. Not perfect. Not as glass smooth as I wanted. See, there's a little bit of rippling. But they did turn out well. Gonna let them cure for at least another week or so while I keep working on the bathroom, and yeah. I do have some finishing on the bottom here. There's some drippage, even though I went through and scraped. It's not nearly as bad as what it would have been if I didn't scrape. But I'm gonna sand the bottom of this, and I'll flip them over and I'll actually reseal them on the bottom again, just to make sure they're good and perfectly sealed. So continue for more.